Hi, I'm Alex White. Have you ever wanted your recording sessions to just sound a bit more exciting? To give the recording session itself a sense of a finished mix? How about simply having an easier time setting the fader levels and getting a balance that's really working and sounding powerful and exciting really quickly? Mix bus compression is an amazing way of getting a head start and achieving a cohesive and glued sound. And it can be done right from recording. There's no reason to wait until mixing to add a mix bus compressor. I want to give you some simple things to listen for in assessing the best compression choices for your aims and a couple of settings to get you started, as well as a few workflow tips. So here we go. First, let's just have a quick listen to the track that we're going to be working on. I'm just going to play the intro, verse 1 and chorus 1, and then we'll stop. This track is a simple arrangement. It's just guitar, bass, drums and a piano. But we can use mix bus compression to make it sound a little bit more exciting and a little bit more polished straight away, even on recording. And although I'm not recording this live in front of you, I'm going to show you what my workflow would be whilst I'm tracking, and it makes just as much sense with a track like this as it does when you're actually recording. Let me open up my mixer and go and have a look at this lovely compressor here. So this is the compressor we'll be using today, the API 2500. Don't worry about the compressor type, it's not that important. They all matter, they all make a difference. Different compressors sound different, but they all sound good. Any compressor you can get from any one of the major manufacturers, from Universal Audio to Waves, Steve & Slate, it doesn't matter, they're all really good. I love Universal Audio, so I use the Universal Audio API 2500 most of the time. I just really like it. It just works for me. And that's part of the fun, I think, is it's finding the stuff that works for you, that you like the sound of, that you enjoy. I'm going to play the track again, and what I want you to listen to is the snare drum in particular. Okay, so we'll go from the verse, I think, because that's where most things are kicking off. I just want you to listen to the snare and pay attention to what's actually happening with it. Okay, here we go. All right. So one of the things is the drums, to me, when I'm listening to this track, sound kind of a little bit forward of the rest of the instruments. The thing is, I know that what usually happens is when you start to turn up the other instruments to try to make the drums sound more balanced, suddenly the drums go away. Well, what can mix bus compression do to help with this? If we open up the mix bus compressor, we're going to focus on threshold, attack, ratio and release as our control set. We're not going to worry about the tone or the link. They do cool things, but just outside of the scope of what we're talking about today. We're also not going to worry about the variable release option here either. Again, an important control, but definitely one of the lesser important controls. The things that we're looking for are these four here. And this is what you'll find on most compressors. Again, whatever compressor you have is brilliant. So, I'm going to set my compressor, and I'm going to explain these settings in a little bit, but I'm going to set my compressor at the fastest attack, so that is 0.03 milliseconds, so super quick. I'm going to set my release medium kind of release at sort of 500 milliseconds, and I'm going to set my ratio at 4:1. Now, what I'm going to do is as we play the track again, I'm going to slowly bring down this threshold. And as I do, I'm going to go way too far because I really want you to hear the actual effect of a mix bus compressor. And I want you to listen to what starts to happen to the drums. Now, you're going to hear a lot of, because we're going to be going so aggressively with it, you're going to hear quite a lot of unpleasant artifacts from the compressor, which is going too far. But it helps to go too far so you can really hear what it's doing that is a benefit. And I just want you to listen to how the drums start to push back into the mix, even though the guitars and the bass and the piano don't really sound like they're losing level. In fact, they sound like they're gaining level. So here we go, let's have a listen. Okay, so you can probably hear how what started to happen is that snare started to get pushed back into the mix. This is one of the best bits about mix bus compression for balancing instruments. It's almost like an automatic balance tool. It isn't, please don't use it as that. There's a lot more to do in a mix, but it's a great start. It can just make your mix sound more punchy and more exciting really fast. So now what I'm going to do is we'll do the same thing again. I'm just going to reduce this threshold until I hear something that I quite like, a nice balance. And then we're going to kind of flip it on and off so you can kind of hear what's happening to that snare drum and how the kick and the snare settle back into the mix. And the snare stops having such a bag of nails sort of effect to it. Now, I don't think the snare's a bad snare sound at all, and bag of nails is unfair. But there's that element that it just removes even more. So let's have another listen. Cool. Okay, so somewhere around there, and there's a little bit of wiggle room. It might be a little bit, it's kind of, currently sitting around that +4 mark. So it might be a little bit either side of that +4, probably more on the safer side, probably more towards the +8. But around there, the snare really starts to settle into the mix. I'm going to play the same section again, and I'm just going to flip this off and on so you can hear that snare pop out of the mix and then pop back in, while the rest of the stuff doesn't really sound that affected. Here we go. Now, if you listened really carefully, you'll be able to hear how that snare suddenly seems to have more of that bag of nails sort of feel to it. It feels disconnected from the mix. Nothing seems that glued together. Now, this is what mix bus compression does so absolutely wonderfully and why so many people mix into mix bus compression and start with it as one of the first things that they do, because when they're doing their fader balances, this helps hugely in getting a nice level really quickly. It makes your job so much easier. You're then not having to compress so much on individual tracks, and it already feels really exciting and really good. So what I want to talk about next is how you set up the controls for the mix bus compressor, and then we're going to come to how it helps in recording. I'm going to keep things really simple. There are two ways you can think about what effect you'd like to apply to the material that you are going to be recording, or perhaps that you've already recorded but just want to try this technique of starting off with a mix bus compressor from the very beginning. First of all, we're going to talk about the attack. The release is important and the ratio is important, but the attack probably has the biggest impact on this auto-leveling the rhythm part of your track. So I'm going to play it again. This time we're going to go over to the 30 millisecond attack time. Okay, here we go. All right, now we're on 30 milliseconds. Let's do an A-B. Here we go. And now let's do an A-B between 30 and 0.03. So you can really hear that big swing between 30 and 0.03. Listen to what happens to the very start of the snare. That's the key. Okay, here we go. The drums get squashed. You can hear how on 30 milliseconds, more of the click, more of the attack, of course, comes through. But what this actually means in terms of the way it sounds is whether you want the drums to be a lighter kind of snappier kind of a sound, maybe that's a better sound for funk or something that needs more pop to the sound, or whether you're going for a fast attack, which is going to give you more of a sort of splat sound to the snare, because that might be better for heavier rock styles. Every single time it's worth experimenting with the attack time to see just how much of that opening click that you'd like to get, because this is everything. Often I will use this 0.03 or 0.1, that kind of territory, for a lot of the things I do, because I like the way that it removes that slightly harsh snap at the beginning of transients. And it's the feel good setting. I find when you're recording things, it just feels fun. Everything sounds kind of like big because you're increasing the sustain of the tail of the sound. So the ratio is the next control that we'll quickly chat about. The ratio, the way I like to use the ratio is, first of all, they all sound a bit different. So I always experiment with just what does 1.5 up to 4 up to 6 sound. Now, just to explain the ratio, it simply means, if we used a 2-to-1 ratio, it simply means for every 2 decibels over the threshold that the sound goes, you only actually get 1 decibel of volume increase. That's all that means. But there are some important features about the ratio. So, for example, if you're dealing with a track that's got quite a lot of dynamics in it, you may find that you pick a 4-to-1 ratio, and that seems really good for some of the track, and then suddenly something big happens and the compressor slams back really hard to catch that big loud sound. That can sometimes sound a little unnatural and a bit too aggressive. So sometimes for more dynamic tracks, I actually use a lower ratio if I want to just dig into the track a bit, because what I know is that I'll be getting a little bit of compression on most of the elements, and if a big sound comes in, the compressor doesn't hit quite as hard, and I still maintain some of those dynamics. If the track is quite dynamic, maybe it's quite dynamic for a reason. With the release time, again, same story as with the other controls. I'm going to be listening to how the release affects things, but simply it's the amount of time it takes for the compressor to start to release the compression once the signal goes under the threshold. A really important tip is, if you have a fast release time, you can start to get some distortions from a compressor. Depending on the kind of music that you're doing and the way it's interacting, you may find, if you want your bass instruments, your kick and your bass guitar, and those sorts of things to remain intact, to remain sounding good, you may find that a better choice is to keep your release time somewhere around 200 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds, or a variable release time. So your particular compressor is going to have its own feel with these controls. Just have a listen. But without a doubt, the attack time is one of my favourites for shaping how drums can be pushed into the mix or not when you're trying to fit drums into that mix, when you're trying to balance and get a sort of easy time of something that all sounds kind of sort of in some funny way a little bit mixed. The attack time's my favourite. So now let's talk about how we can use this in terms of tracking, because once I've had a think about the kind of sound I'm going for, on this it's a rock track, so I'm going to leave the attack time on the faster side. I'm probably going to put it somewhere around, I'm going to go for 0.1. And I'm going to go for 2:1 because there's a little bit of dynamic range in this track and I want to keep that dynamic range, but I do just want to get that snare back into the mix. Now, this is how I would approach using something like this on tracking. First of all, let's turn all the faders down. So I've got a control surface here, so you'll see my faders just dropping in the bottom part of the screen here. We're going to turn everything down. Drum room, bass, guitar, piano, other guitar. Brilliant. This technique relies on you not having recorded really crazy levels. So in other words, when you turn your faders up and they're all sort of at this kind of place, that nothing is so loud or so quiet, it's just silly. So long as you've recorded your music at a fairly sensible level, or at least done clip gain afterwards, which is the thing where you, if I just show you this, which is the thing where you simply get an audio region and you just turn it up or down like that. So long as you've kind of done that and got relatively sensible levels on your recording, then it's no problem. So the way I think about it is like this. Turn everything down. And imagine that we were just recording our kick drum. What I do is I set my level for my kick drum recording, and then I set my compressor up for what I think I'm probably going to want to go for, and I just have the threshold completely open, so no compression is happening. And then I'm just going to play my kick drum. And this is what I'd be doing with recording. So pretend like I've got no other tracks in here and I'm just asking the drummer to play their kick and I'm setting up the kick sound. So this is what it would be like. Okay, cool. I'm going to go straight in for the kill with some mix bus compression. So I've got that. And I'm starting with a sound that I know is going to be a fairly dominant sound in the mix. So you could be recording acoustic guitar music with no drums. That's cool. Just get a sense of the loudest acoustic guitar in that mix. Probably a rhythm guitar, being strummed, played with a plectrum. That kind of thing. Just take a moment to think about it and go, okay, well, let's start with that instrument. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my threshold down whilst my kick is playing until I see some compression. Okay, that's cool. So just getting that needle to work. I've already done the interesting work of really digging in to the threshold to see what difference it makes. So I'm not going to worry about that. Although let's just have a quick look at that just so you can hear the compressor just on the kick drum with some extreme settings. Here we go. Tighter. So one is really bringing out the tail of the drum. The other one is bringing out the click and the knock and kind of chilling out all of the sustain. Which one you want, or a position in between, is entirely up to you and your taste and making a good judgment call for the tracks you're recording. I'm doing this rock thing, so I do want my kick to be a bit more splat. I want it to be in amongst those guitars. So I'll set this up so... Now this is the thing, you see. I know the effect that it's having in extreme settings. I know that's an extreme version of what I want. So I just want to get it to the point where it's going to make a little impact. Just make the sound a little bit more together. And again, speaking from experience, I know that as I start to add everything in, the level is just going to go up and up into the compressor. And so the compressor is going to start working harder. So I will probably tend to go a little bit lower than maybe my ears want me to. Because actually I was quite digging the sound of it over on -8, but that's way too much. So let's kind of leave it somewhere here, I think. you can already hear a bit of steadiness coming in. Now you can imagine that I've set my bus compressor up. Now what I do is I just get rid of the screen. I don't care about it. I'm going to leave it open for our purposes today. And I'm just going to raise up the snare. Here we go. Cool, let's get the overheads in. All right. In fact, just from that, I'm just going to tweak that compressor to be even harder. And this is the way that I think. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Well, the drums are coming in, but I think I can get away with something a little bit more aggressive. That's cool. Again, raising this overhead up and down, just trying to find a balance that I like. I want quite a lot of this overhead in here because for me, I like the sound of the overhead. It was recorded with a ribbon microphone and it has a nice warm kind of tone to it. And I want to make sure that's part of my track, but I don't want it too loud. All right, let's continue on. Let's get some of those toms in there. All right, let's just go to a place in the track where there are some toms. So there are some toms here. Let's have a listen. Cool. I think a little bit too much floor tom there, so let's bring that down. Cool. Maybe even rack tom up a little bit. Now let's double check our mix bus compressor and see what's happening now. Yeah, that's cool. You can see that needle really starting to work on this meter here. Let's jump over to verse 1. And let's bring in the room now, the drum room. Okay, let's just see what's happening with the mix bus compressor. Yep, that's got some really feel-good vibes going on. Bearing in mind this is how I'd be tracking, so I would have done the drum setup by now. I'm not even looking at that mix bus compressor at this point. I'm just recording people now. Then the bass guitarist would come in, or he'd set up his stuff if it was all happening in one go. And then I would balance the bass into the compressor. And the thing is, you will find you just have an easier time finding a level that just feels good. You will just enjoy getting the bass to the place where it feels loud enough, rather than that struggling around going, oh, well, that's too loud, now that's too quiet, because the compressor's just keeping those peaks and those transients of the drums just back in the mix a little bit. It's helping you push the drums into a place where they're not getting in the way of everything else. Let's go for the guitar one. All right, now let's bring in guitar 2, and I'll probably end up taking them both down, but let's have a listen. Okay, I'm just going to balance those two guitars with each other. Now let's bring in the piano. Okay, so what I'm busy doing is I'm busy just gently moving faders very slightly this way, very slightly that way. And that balance, that starting balance before anything happens, this as I say, this is like if I was recording this is how it would be feeling. I'd just be rolling up these faders, getting the gain staging done, getting my volumes for my preamp set, and just getting a sense of cohesion and some sort of glue straight away. Now let's play the track now that I've done that quick setup, and let's listen to what happens when I switch this off, and we'll see how it sounds. So here we go. If you were listening, you'd really hear that snare start to jump out of the mix. It's now no longer balanced against things. Things come undone. They start to disconnect from each other. It shouldn't be an automatic mix tool. That's not what mix bus compression is for. It's for giving everything a sense of agreeing, giving everything a sense of belonging to each other. And when you're tracking, there's no reason why you can't have this going on. Of course, when people are recording, they don't hear the mix bus compressor, but the second you hit play, everyone hears that mix compressor engage, and they go, oh man, everything just sounds a bit better than it did a second ago. That's cool. And you look like a hero. Let's have another listen. I'm going to switch it on and off and listen for the way the instruments come unstuck from each other. Listen to the way that snare goes from sitting in the mix to bouncing out of the mix. Listen to the kick drum and the way the kick drum just doesn't seem to be as, again, glued together, as settled in. Here we go. And that is the wonderful, wonderful abilities of using a mix bus compressor. I think it's worth using it on every single recording you make. Mix bus compression is fantastic. You don't have to use it. There are plenty of people that make records, professional records, without a mix bus compressor. But see if it works for you, because I love mix bus compression and it always just adds a feel-good vibe. And then when you come to the mix, you can tweak your settings. Maybe you decided for the tracking session, your attack time was a little bit too fast. That's cool. But it also makes people make decisions based on that mix bus compressor when they're recording their parts and how hard they're hitting or how softly they're playing or the take that they choose. All of that when recording is influenced by this mix bus compressor. Why shouldn't it be on right from recording? So that's how I would use it. When you're recording, get the first main instrument started, whether it's the acoustic guitar rhythm part or whether it's the kick and the snare, and just get that working into that mix bus compressor. Go extreme for a second, find the tasteful settings that you like the sound of with the release and the attack, how much it punches and pushes, how much it clicks at the start of the sound versus smacks down on the sound, and then just pull that back until, oh, and you know what, I'll give you one little tip, is I tend to never go over 4 decibels of compression when I'm setting it up for tracking. There are so many times when that rule will be broken. There's so many, I'm sure there's plenty of examples where people go to -6 decibels of compression and it sounds great. But if you're just starting with this, 4 is a really good place. Much over 4, and in my experience, more often than not, you'll find your tracks feeling a little bit congested and a little bit crushed. Still doesn't mean the recording session won't sound as exciting as anything, though, because these are excitement machines. I would love to hear what your thoughts are about mix bus compression, about the use of it in a track like this, whether you think recording with it would be a cool idea, and if you have any further questions about using it in the sense of recording, please just leave a comment. I will absolutely respond, and we can have a fun chat about all this fun music making stuff. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. It's been a pleasure having you, and we'll catch up with you on a video very soon.